We have two scriptures, familiar scriptures actually, from Matthew chapter 18, verses 12 to 14. If a man owns 100 sheep, and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 on the hills and go and look for the one that wandered off? And if he finds it, I tell you the truth, he is happier about that one sheep than about the 99 that did not wander off. In the same way, your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should be lost. And Luke's Gospel, 19, verses 1 through 10. This is the story of Zacchaeus. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but being a short man, he could not because of the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone into the house of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Lord, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham." And this is the key verse. "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save what was lost." The Son of Man came to seek and to save what was lost. May God add his blessing to this reading from his word. And thank you for the use of the glasses. I'll try to find my reading glasses. As I get older, I can't see as well. Join the club. I think I can see, and then no, I can't see. Yeah. I was wondering how long it's been since you played hide and seek. Anybody remember playing hide and seek? There you go. You do it with your grandchildren. Yeah. If you had small children in your house, like we had years growing up, that was one of the favorite pastimes that the kids wanted to play, especially if it was a rainy day and they couldn't go outside. Remember those days? I think all children love the challenge of trying to find some place in the house to hide that their parents are not going to be able to find them, right? Of course, that's hard when you're inside because usually parents know where to look, right? But it reminds me of an incident I heard about not long ago. A little boy wanted to play hide and seek with his mother, but his mother was busy doing stuff in the house, as mothers are. She was really too busy to do that, so he began to play hide and seek by himself. He would go and he would find some place to hide, and then he would call out to his mother, and his mother would drop whatever she was doing, and she would find him, and then it would happen over and over again. Just kept going on like that. She would go back to what she was doing, and then he would go find someplace else to hide. And then this happened a number of times. But then the calling out stopped. And the mother just thought the boy had gotten bored. And so he was doing something else. And time passed. And you know, when you have little kids and it's a little too quiet, you remember those days? After a while, the mother realized that it had become really quiet. And so she called out to her son, and he didn't answer her. She got alarmed. She started searching the house, all the places where he would hide or could hide, and he was nowhere to be found. And so she started to panic, and she ran outside and to the neighbors, and they started to search the neighborhood to see if anybody had seen this little boy. Nobody had seen him. Beside herself with worry, she ran back into the house to call the police, and as she was dialing the number, she heard a strange noise coming from the kitchen. And she looked where she kept her pots and pans, and there, curled up, in the pots and pans was her son fast asleep. Hide and seek. A simple game, right? A game we like to play. Kids love to play this game. But they're not the only ones who like to play this game. Did you know adults play this game too? Did you know we hide? We try to hide? Grown-ups like to hide and seek as well, except we try to hide from God. Has anybody ever been there? Try to hide from God. We think that God, we thank God that he doesn't leave us there. He goes like the mother, he goes searching for us until he finds us. The Bible is full of stories about persons who were lost, either lost or tried to hide from God, and God sought them out. Do you ever think about that? Last week we looked at the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and if you remember, after they had sinned, what did they do? They went and hid in the bushes, remember, in the garden. And God came walking through the garden in the cool of the evening, calling out to them, remember? He came searching for them, seeking them, until he found them. He found them. We also have other stories in the Bible about people who hide from God and that God seeks them out. We had the story, 2 weeks ago we talked about the story of Moses and how Moses hid from God in the land of Midian, remember, after he fled Egypt? And God tracked him down and spoke to him through that burning bush. We had the story of the prophet Elijah in the Testament after the prophets of Baal and all that story. He flees and he goes to hide, and God finds him in a cave. You remember the reluctant prophet Jonah, who thought he could flee from God? He discovered that there was nowhere on earth that he could flee, no place that was too far for God to reach. God found him, went out and found him, called him back. Even in the New Testament, we see that our God is a God who seeks. Jesus sought out the 12 disciples. They weren't looking for him so much as he was looking for them, wasn't he? Called out to them in their everyday, mundane lives and challenged them and said, "Follow me." The risen Christ sought out Saul, that guy who was persecuting the church, and made him Paul, the greatest missionary the world has ever known. He sought Paul out on the Damascus Road. But nowhere do we see that our God is a God who seeks more powerfully than in the life and teachings of Jesus. The two stories that I read this evening tell us about that kind of the nature of Christ to call. After his encounter with Zacchaeus, Jesus proclaimed the purpose for his coming into the world. Do you hear what he said? The Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. To seek. And how could this be more beautifully expressed than we find in that parable of the lost sheep, the 90 and 9 and so forth, that tells about the determination of God to search until every last sheep is found. I think that the whole gospel of Jesus Christ can be summarized with the phrase, our God is a seeking God, a God who seeks, searches for us, a God who, like the good shepherd, won't rest until all are brought into the fold, where all who are lost are found. I was blind, but now I see. I was lost. I'm found. You and I aren't so different than the biblical characters. Just like them, we have a tendency to want to hide from God, sometimes deliberately turning our back on God, but more often simply ignoring him. The good news is that God is always actively seeking us out. And aren't we glad he is? We wouldn't be here today if we didn't have a God who sought us out and found us when we tried to hide from him. The truth is that this is the second step on our journey, our path of salvation. Prevenient grace, which means the God who seeks. Prevenient. It's an odd word, but it's an important word. As we're going to learn over the course of our series, one of the main hallmarks of Wesleyan Christianity is this emphasis on this amazing grace of God that just permeates all of life. Grace is God's answer to that original sin we talked about last week. That original sin that holds our life captive. It's the key that unlocks the chains that bind us and frees us to love God and others just as we were intended to in the beginning. What do you think of when you hear the word grace? What do you think of when you hear the word grace? What? Pardon. Okay. Anybody else? Anything else? God's love. If you're like most people, you probably think of that grace that's available to us through the power of the cross of Jesus Christ, the pardon, the way that God shows his love for us, the grace that covers our sin. And of course, we're going to be talking about that aspect of grace in the weeks to come when we talk about the other things that are coming. But perhaps you haven't thought of grace as being prevenient. For whom is that a new word? Anybody familiar with that word? That's a new word. Prevenient, the grace that comes before. Prevenient. It's a word that we don't use very often, but what do we mean by prevenient grace? Prevenient grace is what John Wesley called, the grace of God which comes before our salvation. The grace, Wesley taught that God's grace is at work in our lives even before we're aware of it. Leading us, prodding us, urging us to repent and to be saved. Let me explain it this way. In the scriptures, the relationship between God and God's people is often compared to a marriage between a husband and wife. You've probably heard that. For instance, in Revelation, the church is described as being like a bride who is adorned and prepared to meet her bridegroom. And who is the bridegroom? Yeah, God, Jesus. Jesus is the bridegroom. The church is his bride. Well, if professing faith in Jesus Christ is like exchanging vows on our wedding day, prevenient grace is the courtship period of that relationship. When you accept Christ, exchange your vows on wedding. Well, if something comes before you got married, your spouse, something happened before that, right? You had a courtship period. This prevenient grace is the courtship period of our relationship with God, where God woos us and invites us and urges us and lets us know that he wants to have a relationship with us. Another way that Wesley described this first stage of grace was leading grace. Bob Pierce described this sort of in a tongue-of-cheek way. He said, God gently leads his children. Me he yanks. Some of us have had that experience, haven't we? John Wesley noted that there were three ways in which this prevenient grace, this leading grace, the extravagant grace of God leads us. First, he said that it is the work of the Holy Spirit which creates in us our first sensitivity to God's call in our lives, our first awareness or inkling that God is seeking us and has a plan for our lives. So it's that awakening, that sensitivity, that's the grace of God at work. Second, he says that prevenient grace produces a dawning awareness that we have violated God's will. Sometimes we call that conviction of sin. We've used that kind of language. And that we have not responded to this God's great invitation of grace. And finally, he said, it stimulates our first desire to please God. Our first desire to please God. In other words, prevenient grace sparks our very first inkling of faith without any effort on our part. Before we're ever even aware of it, God's grace leads us to the point where we are able to profess Jesus Christ. Karl Barth was a great theologian of the last century from Germany. He described it like this. He tells about a man on horseback who, without knowing it, crossed over a lake in the dead of winter that was frozen solid. He wasn't aware that he was crossing over this lake. And when he reached the opposite shore and was told the truth about the route he had taken and how risky it had been, he broke down and wept. Because then he could see how it was only by the grace of God that he had made it safely on his journey. Without knowing it, God had led him safely on his way. And this is how we experience God's grace. Like that writer, we can look back over our lives and we can see how God has been at work leading us and prodding us and urging us, even without our knowledge. And just like that man riding his horse, the providence of God, this leading in our lives, is only evidence when we look back. Prevenient grace, you're not aware of it when it's happening. It's when you come to faith and you look back that you see it. And you've been there, I'm sure. I want you to think back now to the time you accepted Christ, if you've done that. I assume most of us have. You might have thought that you came to faith by your own volition. You chose to believe. You might have thought that. It was my choice. And it is your choice. It was your doing. But if you'll stop and consider your life before your conversion, I'm sure you'd be able to see how God was at work in your life before you ever even were aware that God was working in your life, bringing you to that moment when you gave your life to Christ. Maybe he planted the seeds of faith in your heart by giving you Christian parents or grandparents that raised you, or took you to Sunday school, or you had someone in the church who, maybe a Sunday school teacher or a youth director or somebody who planted a seed. Or maybe it could be that you had circumstances in your life, maybe for good or bad. Sometimes people have experiences where they have a bad thing that turns them around and helps them come to see the light, come to faith. Circumstances in your life that play a role in bringing you to faith. Looking back on before you gave your life to Christ, if you have, who was it or what was it that was at work in your life and you weren't even aware of it? For how many of you was your parents? For many of us, it was my parents, or a Sunday school teacher, or some adult, a person of faith who influenced you. I see a hand. A circumstance. Maybe something happened in your life that got your attention and you turned to God. What is it? Think about that. What was it in your life? Or who was it in your life that God was using to bring you to faith? You see, it's a fact that we don't save ourselves. Even when we come to faith, it's not of our own initiative that we come, but instead it is our response to the initiative of God. A God who seeks us out even before we know we're lost. That is prevenient grace. And that is good news. Because that means no one is totally lost. Because God is working on them. And sometimes we are the answer to people. God can use us in touching the lives of people who don't know him yet. We can be the way God's grace touches somebody's life and brings them to faith if we allow God to use us in that way. There's a hymn in our hymnal. We're not going to sing it because it's not a very familiar hymn, but the first verse expresses this idea beautifully. Maybe you've heard this hymn. I sought the Lord, and afterward I knew he moved my soul to seek him, seeking me. It was not I that found, O Savior, true. No, I was found of thee. Isn't that good news? Or as Jesus himself said, the Son of Man came to seek and to save. So, friends, if you are trying to play hide and seek with God, I hope you're not. But if you are, I hope that you'll let him find you. Because he wants to find you and he wants to have that relationship with you. And he wants to lead you into relationship with him.